I think that's working. Hello? Hello? Are there humans there? I see the yo. How about a 5x5, just so I know that I'm being received? Okay, there we go. Alrighty. Hello, people. Hang on a second. I'm going to do my screen management bullshit. Thank you for the 5x5. Okay. Good. Alrighty. So it's Sunday. The weather's beautiful. It's been raining like all hell this morning, but it's cleared up now, and we've got blue sky and blue ocean. And I don't see any space aliens on the horizon, and my horizon is about 17.9 miles from this height, and and we're safe. So anyway, okay, all the weird stuff that's going on. Let's start off with some of the stuff that irritates me, just so that we can get that out of the way. More volume, alrighty. Let's see if we can do something about that. How's that? How's the volume now? Volume is low. The aliens are 18 miles. Well, okay. All right. So let me see. Pattern gain. All right. Are we there? Good sound? Okay. Okay, good deal. Yeah, Sunspot, New Mexico. I don't know about that, but there's been some other interesting stuff here about related deep state weirdness kind of things, right? The 51,000 sealed indictments. I hate that meme. And, the David Wilcock and Jordan Sather and all of these people, they are so facile, so, right on the surface. That site they reference is Pacer, and it's public access to court records, and it allows you to buy at 10 cents a copy sheets of information, and allows you to query their stuff basically any way you want. And so what someone has done is they've queried the number of records hitting the federal, district, appellate, and bankruptcy court ledgers, and they've done that iteratively without dropping off any of those that become unsealed, okay? And so it's a cumulative total. It is a little weird. The actual number of sealed court records at a federal level is ever so slightly higher, but the sealed court cases that Pacer shows are not indictments, all right? The vast majority of the sealed cases are in bankruptcy court. So if I go to bankruptcy court, my lawyer automatically puts in a request that the record be sealed so that my neighbors don't heckle me as I'm driving down the street, right? That kind of thing. Or if I'm a business, if I'm a big corporation, maybe I don't want other corporations that are in the same line of work to know that I'm experiencing certain levels of difficulty. And so they seal the court records before it goes through trial, and sometimes a judge can seal them afterwards. But in any event, the Pacer that these guys cite, Jordan Sather, David Wilcock, and all these other people, the Pacer database that they cite is specifically for appellate court, district court, and bankruptcy court. And if you, obviously, let's think about it, we can eliminate appellate court, because if these were sealed indictments, then it's not pertinent, anything coming out of the appellate court, because these people have yet to be tried and thus could not have, and convicted, and thus couldn't have an appeal. So we can eliminate the appellate court side, and obviously the sealed case load from the bankruptcy side is meaningless. And so if you take those out of the numbers, we're just ever so slightly higher than our usual average. And the usual average that they cite, they say, the record was 1,019 or something like that in 2009. All right, so what they're citing is the active sealed cases on a monthly basis throughout that entire year. And we're only slightly above that. So there's no 51,000 sealed indictments against large numbers of the deep state players that are going to show up and cause us issues here in the future. There may indeed be some small number of sealed indictments, but you're not going to see them in the PACER documents this way because you won't be able to tell them from the bankruptcy cases and the appellate cases as they're being reported by Jordan Sather and David Wilcock et al. They're just citing these large, broad numbers of 51,000 and letting it go at that and assuming that they're all, just because they're sealed, that they're indictments. And it couldn't be further from the truth. There's another aspect of this, too, that everyone has to take into account here. A sealed indictment is a grand jury issue. You can get away in some areas, in some jurisdictions, with grand juries as small as 6 individuals and then the staff of the court. Even if we assumed that that was the case, then you've got to end, in order to support the 51,000 number, you would have to assume at a bare minimum, most places it's going to require 12 people, but just assume at a bare minimum everybody got away with a 6-person impanelment on a grand jury in order to create a sealed indictment and get some individual in the deep state. You're going to have to start doing some math here. 51,000 times 6, that's how many jurors are going to be involved. You can also get involved in terms of the number of hours involved there for those jurors, because each indictment has an average of 18 hours, or a minimum threshold of about 18 hours of actual process time that it takes to create one of these things. So 51,000 times 18. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is the number of courts that would have to be involved, the number of judges that would have to be involved in the 51,000 number, and then the number of attorneys. It would be so large that you'd be looking at, on the order just on the courts and the number of people that knew, you'd be looking at 600,000 plus people nationwide. And 600,000 plus people nationwide don't keep their mouths shut about this kind of stuff. And then it would be rippling out through all of the attorneys. So you would hear about it in your locality if you had any kind of a contact with an attorney, because they'd just be itching to tell you this secret news that they learned from their local county clerk or whoever they learned this kind of thing from. Because there would be all kinds of work for attorneys, and we're just not seeing it. It's just, I've asked attorneys locally, and they think, the wheels have come loose. There's nothing like that going on in Washington State. So anyway, the 51,000 number, it's like, it's seriously bogus because it includes the bankruptcy filings, which is the majority of the sealed cases. And that's the majority of the sealed cases in the normal course of events is going to be bankruptcy. The highest other one, by the way, is shading towards family services kind of things, where it's, child protection or, spousal abuse, and they're trying to get restraining orders and this sort of thing. All of those are sealed. So you've got to eliminate all of the regular kind of crud that humans get into. Now, okay, so that having been said, I've heard from a reliable friend who's in the business that there's been an uptick in the amount of people, and it's more than doubled, and we actually have a number because this is going through a checkout process, and it's more than doubled in this year, so we're looking in the last 9 months, and what's more than doubled is the number of individuals in high-level civil service positions at a federal level that are requesting and getting books and information about military tribunals. So, someone put a scare into somebody. It's not like there's hundreds and hundreds of these individuals that are doing this, but the number that and the people that can access this particular set of documentation is relatively limited, and the mere fact that, a reasonably small number has doubled very suddenly after being very stable for years. Last time there was anything close to this was 2003 as part of the Iraq stuff. So anyway, so there's that aspect of it. Okay, so I'm going to let's do that now. I'm going to give a shout out to Richard Dolan, who is a internet personality guy and all of that kind of thing, and has a nice looking garden. He's also a publisher, and he published this book, The Legacy of 1952, Year of the UFO, by Bruce Maccabee, and it's pretty good. I like the 1952 is a particularly interesting year for a lot of different reasons relative to UFOs. And it was a peak year in terms of total number of sightings and total spread of the total number of sightings. It has never been repeated, the total number of sightings, etc., although we are now shading back up towards it. And so if one were to examine and look at the book there, you'll find some very interesting examination of ideas about things other than the ET hypothesis, right? So nowadays, you've got people running around in the New Age movement that are, in the UFO community that are talking about interdimensional or, quasi-material life forms, all different kinds of things as explanations for UFO appearances. In the documents that are cited in this book, there's references to that sort of thinking off on a side, but it primarily concentrates on the history of that particular year and our understanding of the events, or lack of understanding of the events that were occurring that year, especially things like the flyover of Washington, D.C. by all of these UFOs and that sort of thing. What's interesting at the moment is the repetition of a particular cycle that's 66 years long. So if we look back from today, 66 years ago was 1952. Back 66 years from 1952 was 1886, which was another peak in what we can think of as UFO activity. At the time, they were calling them airships. And there was all kinds of stuff at the time. Okay, no. Why did it do that? I didn't want it to show the... Oh, I see. That's what's going on. Okay, because it's the focus is on the wrong one. Oh, I see. And I've also lost my... Sorry, I'd lost my reference here. Setting stuff up for this, I destroyed a particular web page I was going to reference. So I'll go back to that other... There we go. Okay. So anyway, in 1886, there was a number of incidents. The range of UFO activity changed that year from the what had been primarily in the northern hemisphere, the reports of airships, okay? And that was, the airships could be thought of as vehicles that were slow-moving enough that people on the ground could hear them and see lights, as well as hear people on the airships, and yell up at those people and hear them yelling back, although the communication was somewhat garbled. That was also 1886 was the last year that we had reports of the airships landing for assistance. Okay, so let me see, there was like the pre-Aurora incident. There was a couple of incidents in Texas where airships had landed and attempted to get water, or they needed to get food, this kind of thing. And so there was some level of contact between someone in an airship and someone on the ground. In 1886, that was the last officially reported part of that peak of the airship phenomenon. And okay, so the shift in that year went towards, and it was like instant, went towards what we now think of as like the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind of thing, right? Or first kind, where the guy is getting irradiated, all of this kind of thing, where strange stuff becomes magnetized, all of the stuff that we were seeing in that movie was first reported in 1886. Most of those kinds of effects were being reported in the southern hemisphere before they became reported here in the northern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, we had a more benign or pedantic kind of a situation where the airships were trucking along at 150 miles an hour, could slow down and hover and talk to people and that kind of thing, and appeared to have decks around them, and they looked a lot more 18th century. But down in the southern hemisphere during that year, we started getting real UFOs that shot down beams of light, that did nasty things to cattle, all of this sort of thing. And you'll find that 1886 was a peak year, and we're looking at a 66-year cycle there. And you go back another 66 years, and you can find fewer reports, but still some. And so we're at one of those points where I think the ramp up this year is related to that 66-year cycle. Now, I don't know if that cycle is related to any other cycle, 66,000 years or not. I mean, there's so many that add up within the 66. So that was just something to bring up here, that this year is likely to be a little bit, 2018 is likely to be a little bit chock-a-block full of UFO sightings, and in terms of our relative last few years, it's going to be a nice little peak. Still seems to be running that way. Okay, so let's see. Got a bunch of things I wanted to get into here that were, as I say, annoying me. Ran into a bunch of videos about AI, and there's been it's interesting. Okay, so I did the last live chat, first time I'd done anything online for a number of months. Within minutes, actually within like 15 minutes or so, one of the algorithms had been triggered. There were copies of that chat as well as copies of some of my older stuff being chopped up and reloaded to YouTube. And so the AI, that is, so the algorithms that are being used for copyright theft are fairly current. They stay apparently fairly current. They seem to have some level of threshold as to what they want in the way of who they're willing to steal from. And it was triggered. It was quite clear because prior to that, for the past few weeks, there hadn't been anything at all. So it's my activity that actually triggered it. And I kind of wondered about that. Is it my upload activity that maintains the algorithm's interest in me? And that if I didn't do any uploading over time, would it gradually chill out and leave me alone? And sure enough, that is the case. So we can deduce quite a bit about this, the AI being used there. Anyway, I'd run into some stuff as a result of Elon Musk being on Joe Rogan and being all freaked out about AI. He's not a programmer, so he doesn't really understand what AI is and how it's going to be used. And AI is not really something that's going to spring up on its own, and computers don't have any motivation to do shit on their own. The fear is that the AI is going to somehow be motivated to kill all the humans. And, people don't really understand what humans are, what motivation is, and how we get action. If some human programmed into a piece of software go and kill all the humans, well, then the software would attempt to go and kill all the humans. But no AI is going to come to a conclusion on its own and then be motivated to act on that conclusion, because we don't have anything that is a prompt to action for computers. So in other words, and this is the same core issue that gets all of the transhumanists, okay? And this is where transhumanism breaks down at a very fine level, and it's very difficult to refute. So the transhumanists have this idea that they're going to somehow, they can't define it, they can't say where it's located, and they can't do things with it, but they're somehow going to move consciousness out of a human into a machine. And so at the moment, they seem to be defining consciousness as the sum total of all of your memories. But they're going to, there's this like lack there in the sense that a memory within the body may have an emotion that's associated to it that is in some way reflection or a mature process reflection of emotions felt at the time that that memory was made. But those memories don't bring the emotion, or don't have attached to them, they're not carrying the emotion that they bring up within the human. So it's in a programming sense, it's like, you've got text and you've got an image, and they're in separate containers. And in the text thing, you've got a link over to the image bin for a particular image to show in this particular spot in the text. And that's very much the way that things really sort of work, in the sense that the memory is necessarily tied via a link to the human body in which that memory was created, because that human body had a unique set of circumstances, hormonally, DNA, everything, that provides the emotional component to that memory. And that memory, taken out of context of that physical body, won't have the necessary detail attributes to trigger the emotional response that should be tied to that memory. And so you'll never be able to recreate consciousness as the transhumanists seem to experience it, which seems to be, in terms of all of their writings and their definitions and stuff, seems to be as a component of a memory with an emotional component to it. And so the thing about this is that this has been very well studied since, maybe even the 60s. I went to University of Washington in this exploration period when I was doing the Vortex software, the Read Very Fast software. And we went on up to the University of Washington, myself and this business partner. We met with some people in the microvision lab, and these guys were the ones that were working on what ultimately became Google Glasses. And the Google Glass experience, basically, which is a cell phone hidden in the frame of your glass that operates at a particular level. Anyway, so we went and we met with them, and through them, I had introductions to these people that were working on the issues, I think under military contract. And I just chatted with them for, a few weeks. I didn't get involved in any formal way, but I helped them think through a few of their things and gave them objections to some of their line of thinking. But their idea was to create, if you will, a training aid. Okay, so in the 50s, there were science fiction books that talked about entertainment called feelies that would be like movies. And you'd go in, and we would think of them perhaps as a virtual reality kind of a thing these days. But in any event, you'd go into a theater, and you'd sit down in the books that use this aspect, and you'd sit down in the theater, and you'd somehow plug in, and you'd not only see what the makers of the movie wanted you to see, but you'd also feel it in your body. So and it would be, all different kinds of emotions and hormonal rushes and so on. Personally, I think this is wildly dangerous. You get some of these things, you'd jack yourself in, and then you'd go into an action thriller, and some poor old fellow like myself might keel over dead because the force of it all on you. However, that was the thinking in the 50s, that this would be the next wave of, they thought by the time we got into the 70s or 80s, this would be the next wave of entertainment, which would be these feelies. And so, long story, I'm back in the 90s, and I'm talking to these guys about some of the things I'd learned about timing in the brain relative to reading and computers, because that's what my software did, was it showed you the words in a very special way, one word at a time, at a blindingly fast rate, and you read in a way that didn't involve the saccadic movement of the eyes. So the saccadic muscles were not involved. And you'd sit there, but you wouldn't glaze over. It was not meditative. It wasn't hypnotic. And in fact, it actually went the other way. And just as a deviation here, as a distraction, as an aside, the reason I stopped supporting Vortex was that there'd been a couple of incidents in Japan where software that ran on a similar timing sequence on modern monitors was causing kids to go into seizures. So I didn't want that, and Vortex was a pain in the ass to try and sell into the industry anyway. So I decided I wasn't going to support it anymore. But anyway, so I'm talking to these other guys though about their attempt to move into the Feelies world, and that's where I get a lot of my information. So a lot of it is presumably dated, but some of the things they found were basically fundamental truths. And some of the things that they found were the actual data was disturbing to the people I was talking to because they didn't want that. They wanted to find something else, such that they could conceivably do Feelies, or if they could do that kind of thing, they could presumably download consciousness, etc. Right? And so so anyway, so the transhumanist idea of downloading your consciousness in terms of all of your memories into the cloud or onto a machine or whatever is basically extremely flawed. In a machine, there's nothing to create emotions, there's nothing to react to the emotions, and that's where a major component of this, of life, and consciousness is experience of life comes in. And without that experience, consciousness doesn't exist as the transhumanists understand it. So anyway, these people piss me off, but I do have my little joke. And my joke is the transhumanists that are going to, because before they try and move you into a machine, they'll try doing head transplants. That's a natural step along the way, the evolution of whatever they're thinking in the way of the technology. And so we'll get to this situation where a rich guy is dying, as is not rich guy. Some arrangement is made. They both die simultaneously. The rich guy's head is moved over onto the not rich guy, and everything is, the rich guy's body presumably is old and wasted and passes off, and the fusion of the two in the hospital wakes up, and he looks around and says, oops, we really screwed up. I'm the not rich guy. And it's because, and the scientists wouldn't understand it, but it's because the soul and the seat of consciousness is not in the noggin. That's where we keep our brain and our four senses. But we don't keep consciousness there. Consciousness is actually attached to the body through the pancreas. And the primary manipulator of consciousness within its attachment to the pancreas is through the vagus nervous system. And this is something that NASA validated when they sent a bunch of people over to watch the Tibetan monks do their meditative stuff and then exhibit the superpowers. And they found out that indeed certain parts of the body get really active when things like this are going on and other parts don't. So for instance, one of the tests is that the monk sits there in the middle of the winter on the side of a mountain with ice all around and stuff, and they put a wet sheet on him, and he's going to dry this sheet through his meditative process, and he's not going to die of hypothermia. And so that while he's doing this, they've got the infrared cameras and this kind of stuff on him, and lo and behold, what happens? Well, the brain cools. The head cools off. He goes into a meditative state. He does the eye trickery that flips the brain a particular way. And then the head cools off, and where it heats up is the pancreas and the vagus nervous system. And indeed, thereafter, the sheet dries. And they were hoping to use some of this kind of stuff in space, some of this super knowledge, these superpowers. And so that's why NASA used, taxpayer dollars to go and suss all this stuff out. But it confirms that the seat of attachment where energy is drawn into the key body in this universe is through the pancreas and the vagus nervous system. So might be something actionable there in terms of there's a lot you can do with the vagus nervous system. Probably quite a few videos about how to strengthen it, and the exercises that the yogis do to allow you control at a conscious level of what are presumably unconscious processes. All right, so that one is gone. Anyway, so transhumanists are going to be plucked, and they're just going to be proven wrong after a lot of expenditure of effort and so on. But we'll see that I think they'll probably take a new tact once they get their head transplants and learn that indeed the brain is nothing more than an antenna that connects it with the memories, which are stored in an entirely different fashion that not in the physical brain. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so we've got that. Okay, so there's some stuff coming out in C60 News, and I can't tell you what the details are because there were some patents that were filed and I haven't been released to discuss about those. But it's a major improvement in C60 from not in the molecule itself or any of that, but in the delivery system. And we should see something about that in the next couple of weeks. C60 with the NR, the niacinamide riboside, is just kick-ass stuff. 64, I'd have to swear that, I'm not, I'd say maybe when I feel real tired and now my muscles and stuff are sore and I'm still recovering. And, I've been slit from crotch to gullet almost, up to my sternum. And so I've got a lot of muscle damage to repair and all of that sort of thing. But, and it's only 2 months on, but in general, I'd have to say I feel like the energy levels I had when I was in my 40s. And I did a blood draw in my 40s and had all different kinds of stuff run. I'll have to analyze against that and see where I'm actually out on my various different numbers. But I do know that things like testosterone are still at the same level as in my 40s. Iron and stuff, absorption rates are still at that level now. So all of these things are really good. A lot of it, I think, is related to the cleansing component that C60 does. Now, some of the interesting things here, okay, so there's reports here via, okay, first off, just sort of a housekeeping thing. Ken, the chief scientist at C60 Purple Power, has a podcast twice a week with the science about what's going on with it and this sort of thing. So you can keep up with the latest and greatest news from his perspective there. And as far as I knew, C60 was a antioxidant, and its effects, in my thinking, were constrained to what I had normally considered antioxidants to do, except that C60 could do it repetitiously because it didn't get used up the way that antioxidant like a vitamin C molecule might, right? Because see, when vitamin C molecule picks up some oxidative stress debris in your cells, it gets used up. That particular molecule of vitamin C gets used up and is done. C60 neutralizes the oxidative stress, turns it into water, gives the water over to the system to be excreted out through the kidneys or through the bowel, and then it in the process gets recharged and it goes after some more oxidative stress. And so it does this repetitiously, and eventually, I think over the course of like 10 or 12 hours, then that particular chunk of C60 is also washed out of the system. But it doesn't use itself up or burn it out its chemical potential the way that the vitamin C and other antioxidants do. But as far as I knew, that was its primary benefit, was the cleaning up of the oxidative stress. And it may be that that's like one of 3 benefits that you get from C60 that are, and the other 2 are very long term, and you got to really go and look for them. Okay, so actually there's sort of 3 there. Anyway, the key one here is that the C60 molecule does appear through some mechanism that I go into some aspects that I do know about, but I don't know the complete mechanistic explanation of how it's working. But it does appear to have lengthening effects on telomeres, not merely stopping them from degrading, but actually lengthening the buggers. And telomeres are the copy key for your cells. Okay, so if you've ever worked in an office that was like anally retentive, paranoid, they would give you these little keys back in the day when they were like Xerox machines. And in order to get a copy, you'd have to plug the key into the copy machine, and it would then give you a key. And it was an access code. It was a pass code. But it would also, it was cumulative. It would keep track of, how many copies you had. And some companies could be really tight on it because, copies were new and they were expensive then. And so they might limit you. And so you'd have a limit. And that's what a telomere was. You can only make so many copies of a cell before the cell gets all degraded and the DNA is fuzzy and wonky and the cell becomes fuzzy and wonky and a problem to you. And so that's why telomeres are there, because these fuzzy, wonky cells are the ones that go on to become cancers. So the body doesn't want to have those. And so telomeres are, well, when it gets down to this level, screw it, can't get replicated cell, you're out of here. Anyway, though, so C60 appears to provide longer telomeres. Again, as I was saying, the initial test, I thought, were saying that it simply stopped the level of degradation and held it stable at the time that you started introducing the C60. But not so. Some of the tests are seemingly showing, and it's, I got to wait for them to be replicated, but we should see that at the end of this year. There's 2 more underway showing that there's actual telomere lengthening. And so that's one of the hidden benefits, is that over time, whether it's the immune system being boosted, whether it's the lack of oxidative stress in your system, and thus you're not producing as much material to degrade the telomeres, and so they stay pristine longer. Well, whatever the mechanism is, over time it appears that those telomeres are actually lengthening. And so this is perhaps one of the mechanisms for considering C60 an anti-aging product. Now there's another aspect of this too, that just some people are investigating at the moment, and there's some positive results. The only test I'm aware of involving humans in a clinical fashion is in Europe. I think it's in northern France, and it's a small number of people, and it's just started. Like literally like 2 weeks ago, I got a notice saying, hey guy, we're doing this, and here's what we're shooting for. So they're not going to have any results for some period of time. But they're getting a jump start on it because they're starting on people that have been using C60 for at least a year. And at a known quantity. I think they've got 12 or 13 people in their sample. Anyway, though, what they're looking at is C60 impact on stem cells. Both the number you've got and the type differentiation. And so the French guy who's running the study for some, which I suspect is a pharmaceutical company, but for some people out of Switzerland, is of the opinion that C60 elevates the level of both new stem cells as well as tightly differentiated stem cells. So in other words, stem cells that are like sort of come into existence, pre-programmed to go to specific parts of your system and do specific things. So there's 2 types, sort of a general stem cell that can wander along and become, a nose hair cell or something, who knows. And then there's these others that are, they're going to become part of your blood supply, that sort of thing. And both of those are boosted. Now, if this is the case, hey, this is this would be very good indeed. This would be really cool to learn, because stem cells are a major energy booster, and that's the real complaint you see for old people is energy. Now, I actually think that NR and C60 together as a combination form, just for me anyway, especially as a convalescent, just the perfect balance now for retrieving energy that I had lost to this nasty thing of accumulating birthdays, passage of time. Let's see, that's right. Okay, so not too elegant segue out of irritants over to something about time stuff. I've mentioned that I'm doing some ray gun, some experiments with the intent of building a ray gun, and like a 1950s ray gun, Flash Gordon kind of thing. Strange rays coming on out and weird things happening as a result. Anyway, so I'm doing some time experiments, and I'm quite convinced that time is not as we've had it described to us, and that we need a whole new vocabulary, because the way we've got now, time is just so encapsulated in such a large context. It's difficult to get down and drill into it without getting bogged down in just this issue. But so a couple of things is that some of my experiments, which I could do very low cost, just sitting here while I was sick, it was just little tiny bits of stuff, have proven very successful, and surprising so. And at its core, one of the issues is the creation of a thing that Kozyrev called an irreversible action. And I've discovered a way to use magnets to do this without requiring some people that I know of that are also doing these kind of experiments are using stuff like spark plugs in a trigger. I had this conversation with a guy who was in his lab when he was doing it. And it was very annoying, but it was also very illustrative in terms of how he was approaching this irreversible action approach. And he was doing it with a thumb trigger and a spark plug from some big old car. I can't remember, one of the largest spark plugs I'd seen. And it was working within his experiment. It was yielding some low-level responses, as is predicted by some of the theories that Kozyrev have. And if we can magnify some of these low-level responses, then you might be able to get a useful ray out of this. Whether it ends up being like, a repulsor ray and you aim it at something and it pushes away, or an attractor array, or something that ages your wine, or that kind of thing. It involves this issue of entropy and negative entropy. But in any event, so this guy's spark plug worked, and he got these low-level responses. And we were both congratulating him and discussing it all. And then later on, I went and did my experiments, and I did mine with magnets. And in my design, I could do this with magnets that were in a particular configuration, and a little tiny servo motor that would move these magnets relative to each other. And they wouldn't have to the servo motor wouldn't have to be that big, and you could probably run the whole thing on a couple of, AA batteries, at least that aspect of it. So anyway, though, so this was also a big leap in the experimental level relative to the ray gun, which at this point is, it's not even a ray gun. It's just this big experimental box, really, because I'm trying to be able to isolate and also deal with the issues of magnet amplification of the output waves as a result of the irreversible action, but also be able to polarize them and sharpen them in a laser kind of a fashion. And so I haven't had much success there, but I was able to replicate the same level of action as was caused by this large spark plug that was operating on a 12 volt with a very small movement of some reasonably powerful magnets. So that was kind of cool. But it also validates the idea that time stuff is mutable. So that, as I say, we need a whole new descriptive language for time, for temporal engineering and that sort of thing. I don't think it's possible to move in time. I think it's possible to move around time, but you'll never come back to a particular year or be able to go forward to a particular year. Doesn't mean, though, that it's not a practical and worthwhile, profitable sort of an endeavor to get into temporal engineering, because we could probably do predictive analysis at a great degree on all different kinds of stuff, just having a slightly different paradigm about how time actually works. And this is also probably the same stuff that they ran into with the quantum computers. Okay, yeah, so I won't go into this other thing at the moment. Okay, so some quick kind of stuff. Where are we on time already? Predictive kind of crap, right? Or first off, let's do. No, this is actually sort of predictive. Okay, so at the moment, you've got a lot of things that are pending, like like the Pillar wallet stuff is pending. They're making headway. There's activity, but it's not yet a finished, launched, polished product, right? But all of the pending stuff contains a certain emotional component that has measurable levels of energy in various emotional gradients that will include things like anticipation going all the way down to fear, or anxiety going all the way down to another form of fear. But in any event, so the sum total of the emotional gradient is what we lump in the emotional reduction engine I've got, and we take this from the words, we lump this around particular keywords relative to the object that we're trying to suss out its potential future. And so in example, let's take Pillar here, because there's some new stuff showing up with Pillar. And the new stuff is about an industry-wide idea that will be part of the cryptocurrency land race, or area that each company is trying to, corral for their own brand. And so this new idea is the idea of a generic payment system, a way that would supersede or would be, okay, the word is in the computing trade is superior, but they don't mean that it's got airs or an attitude or anything. It simply is a higher level, a higher class of blockchain and blockchain interaction. And so the idea is that anybody could receive cryptocurrencies, basically whether or not they even had a wallet, all right? You would have to have an identity. You'd have to have a trackable identity that could be traced back to some form of a digital receptor. That digital receptor could be your phone, it could be an email, it could be a bank account, virtually, it could even be a printer, okay? So you could even do this where the cryptocurrencies or the value in them could be printed out as codes. Your printer could accept it, and then you could take these things down and they could be scanned at your local emporium and converted into goods, so you'd be able to spend them. So the idea is that there's going to be this universal payment system, and thus some of the benefits involved are seen as obstacles by some of the participants that have been kicking around this idea. But some of the benefits involved include the reduction of time being spent by the guys in various cryptocurrency niche areas trying to promulgate their particular solution to a payment system. So they wouldn't have to try and sell, you wouldn't have to have somebody from Litecoin constantly out there trying to sell Litecoin as the payment system of choice, right? It just wouldn't matter anymore. They would be able to sell it on different, they'd be able to boost the adoption on different differentiation points within the market that didn't involve attempting to establish an emotional link between the person and that particular currency, which is what we're basically at now. And so the idea would be that if this universal payment system was adopted, and this is where we're getting it back to the pillar, is that there would be an implementation of that in all of these various different wallet producers who would then be differentiating their own product and their own brand by whatever else it was they brought to the table, but that we would have a decentralized but controlled or a mob-ruled API for coders to use for this generic payment system. So it wouldn't matter in the future as a coder, what you were actually building. You could just grab some library code and plug it in there, and whatever you're doing, whatever it is you're building, maybe you're building some smart logic for your shoelaces. So they'll know how to tie a particular knot. And you could even fold in the idea that shoelaces demand that the person wearing the shoe give them some money before they perform this extraordinary feat of tying this very special knot. And you could, as a programmer, you could actually code that in because there would be this universal payment system. And so the shoelaces would not have to know that they were getting paid in Litecoin versus, some other coin. Anyway, it struck me as a good idea, and I've been part of the discussion on some of these programming boards about the cost-benefit return on investment of trying to do this sort of thing. And I think a lot of people are actually going to be shifting some of their efforts over that way. I don't know if there's going to have to be a consortium or a pan-crypto world, cryptosphere, council to work this all out, or how they're going to go ahead and do that. I don't know how it'll evolve, but it's a good damn time to do it, because in a lot of the big headlines that we're getting out of the data sets are right in line with our long-term data forecast from years ago, and they're also right in line with all of the telling indicators of the moment, and they're basically signaling for a global currency, fiat currency replacement. We can't say global reset. We can't, because it's not going to be happening by diktat. So nobody's going to, there's not going to be a El Presidente sitting up there here in the U.S. that's going to say, okay, everybody from now on has to use these blue space alien chicken eggs as money. It's not going to be put out that particular way. There's too many people. It's not a Bretton Woods. It's not a global power structure negotiating with itself sort of a thing. Yet it's going to change, because the last global power structure thing that we have was the modification that Nixon put on everything in 1972 when he took the U.S. off of the gold standard and put us on the petrodollar. At that stage, it was basically a modification of the agreements that had been enacted at the end of World War II. Didn't do away with them. It was just a way of doing away with the particular crises that they had at that moment by adding on these other layers. Now we don't have any other layers to add on. But we nonetheless need to modify these agreements, because we're seeing the effects now. We had long-term data back, 1999, it was forecasting currency crash, et cetera, real problems. And that data is actually playing out now. We've got, all of these various currencies in dire straits. The Turkish currency, you got euro that's under strain. You've got the whole European Union under strain. There's currency crises in South America, currency crises in Africa, and they're all related to basically to the liquidity problem or the death of the U.S. dollar. And so this is basically what's happening is that when the Federal Reserve Bank, which is not part of the federal government, has no reserves and isn't a bank, created money in 1913, they said that it had the purchasing power, one of these pieces of paper had the purchasing power of $1 silver, which was a known amount of silver. And so they established the purchasing power in 1913. Now that dollar, because of the 2% goal of every year, the inflation that they wanted to run, now that dollar has a couple of pennies worth of purchasing power and is dying. But currencies don't just walk along and then keel over dead. So what happens is the currencies crumble like a zombie that's just been around too long, and then all of his body parts are falling off. And we're seeing the body parts fall off in the form of all of the currencies that are in other countries that are in some way seriously impacted by the dollar itself. Either there's lots of military bases in that country from the U.S., and therefore our dollar is polluting their local currency through the American military within their environment spending into their local economy, or we have official relationships with them that basically do that same level of pollution. And so you have all of these points of pollution of our currency into theirs. Now, as our dollar has gotten to the point where it doesn't have much of purchasing power, we've had to ship out larger and larger quantities to foreign nations in order to pay for all of the goods that we buy with paper. We give them little green pieces of paper, and actually we give them electronic digits now, and that's about it. But in any event, in order for this to or as this occurs, as the degradation of the purchasing power progresses, the amount of the dollars that we have to pay out is larger, And that mere number being larger, even though we're just printing up this stuff as fast as we can, that mere number being larger puts a particular constraint on how we deal with money and then the numbers and stuff involved. And we find ourselves in a situation where we pull back as a nation on spending things as these numbers become larger and larger. And so we have a situation where, like the hyperinflation that hit Germany after the end of World War I, in that same vein, we have Americans that are not buying as much as they used to overseas. And now we also, by the way, have the administration here of the U.S., the political administration, going out about the idea of tariffs. So let's take a brief historical diversion and note that tariffs came into existence in the 30s, or tariffs left our existence in the 30s as the income tax came into existence. The income tax was sold to middle class and lower class America as a way to tax the rich and remove tariffs from their lives, because tariffs were a horrid thing for the poor, because they put tariffs, they were trying to raise money, and they slapped tariffs on those things that people bought, and those things that people bought in mass. And most of the masses, the stuff that they were buying was, on a cheaper level, so it was really impacting the poor far, far more than anybody that was upper middle class or rich at all. Tariffs were just a non-existent thing to them. And so the feeling was, it was pointed out to the population that, oh, look, the rich, yeah, they're still paying the same amount of tariff on, milk or whatever goods that we're importing here, butter or whatever, but, it's disproportionate to their income. So what we need is an income tax. So they sold us the idea of an income tax and said they'd do away with the tariffs, which was pretty much the case. The tariffs went away, but the tariffs were going to go away anyway because of World War II. Because you can't have a lot of tariffs if you're bombing people and not trading with them. So you need some other mechanism for raising money. So they came up with the idea of the income tax, and they sold it, and we're now a slave to the income tax, and which is neither here nor there. Now they're talking about bringing tariffs back, though, on top of the income tax, and that's like, whoa, that's going to really put a huge impact on the ability of the American populace to purchase those goods that they're putting the tariffs on. It may be moot, though, because a lot of these goods may not be falling under the realm of the tariff anymore, as the power structure of America starts bringing back manufacturing. But it's not going to bring back jobs. They're just going to bring it back to robots that can do a precise job of getting this stuff out the door without adding the cost of, pee breaks and coffee breaks and that sort of thing. So it's going to be interesting. But anyway, getting back to the pillar thing, the generic payment and the process and that sort of thing is going to be part of, that's showing up now in some of the data sets as being a big deal throughout the crypto world as we go forward. So it's as though the system is starting to morph in anticipation, anthropomorphizing there, and in anticipation of more fiat crumbles in the next few years as the sci-fi world emerges. So from a basic viewpoint, in our data sets, we don't have a giant global economic crash. There's a whole lot of words to that effect. There's a whole lot of words to the effect of stock market crashes and up and down, bull markets, bear markets, etc., and big gyrations and flash crashes. But there's not a descriptor set that we can say holds values relative to a global economic crash and what would follow. So we have, for instance, a lot of language about the stock market here in the U.S. Taking some big hits. But in general, it's not like it's going to, the stock market doesn't really represent a fair take on the economy. At the same time that that's happening, we have a lot of stuff that's in other smaller sets or other different sets that are going to the idea of the emergence of this new sci-fi economy, in new sci-fi world. And that includes a lot of hints that we're going to have major manufacturing back in the U.S., but a lot of it's going to be robotic. So it's just going to be kind of odd, I think, over these next 2 years as we go through the crumbling of these various peripheral fiats. It'll probably be, if I had to guess based on the long-term data, I'm going to say maybe 18 months from now. So what are we looking at here? So probably, say, April, May of 2020, that we'll be getting into the problems, and that would fit relative to some of the weather issues we've got in there too, that we're going to get into some severe problems with the shakiness of the U.S. dollar. Okay, so we've got about 18 months at the very earliest. That's where the early parts of the data seems to show up relative to the national U.S. Economy and our balance of trade and our ability to purchase things and crises relative to the dollar and foreigners. So if you've got, got some stuff to do and got some dollars, this would be the time to do it. I'm not giving financial advice or anything like that. I'm just saying, and I'm not saying that the dollar is going to be worthless after that. I'm just saying that that's the first time that we have any kind of anything show up within the data sets that looks like a global dollar crisis. It does seem to have the same sorts of emotional peaks as we're seeing in the 2008 crises. Again, that's 18 months out, but those emotional peaks, while very much larger, are at the same, or of the same configuration as the emotional peaks that we get around the economy the end of this year and in 2019. So 2019 seems to be lots of mini crises, but it isn't until 2020 that I have any kind of data set that says there's a crisis of the dollar and there is actual international repercussions on that crisis. So let me be very clear about that. So across 2019, we very well could have a situation where, say, letters of trade were canceled, and you had headlines that reported that, I don't know, the Hyundai, I'm making this up, okay, that XYZ auto dealer in Podunk, Illinois, had their shipment turned back around and sent back to Korea because their letter of credit was canceled. And that language would show up maybe in a regional way around Podunk, Illinois. Okay, and we'll have a lot of these kind of financial crises at various different levels throughout 2018 and through to 2019. But the first data sets that show anything where headlines would report it at a national level don't show up until 2020, and it's about the fourth or fifth month in. And the headlines then would be of a different kind because they would say, they may reflect the same kind of thing. Ship turned around with cars on it, headed back to port of origin. But in this case, the language in the headlines would report because of the U.S. dollar crises and the refusal or inability of the port of origin to accept those dollars. And so the payment idea was canceled, and there you go, right? So now at that point, we have repercussions. So the very far edge of the long-term data, there's the idea that there's repercussions from all of the financial stuff going on. However, the stew that we're going to go through that we're in now, have been in for the last couple of years, and we'll really get into next year, is a stew of all of these political and economic collapses of massive changes. Now, it's the change component that is heartening because at the same time that this is occurring, we've got sci-fi world arising, right? There's indications that there will be investments in building for factories and for environmentally controlled, or however we're going to look at it, farms. And there'll be factories to build robots for these. And there'll be factories to build the factories and that sort of thing, where people start reinvesting in the manufacturing infrastructure within this country, partially or at least it'll be said this way in the headlines, as a result of the tariffs coming in, because the tariffs will indeed be represented as actually being a motivating factor for manufacturing coming back, because they won't have to pay the tariffs because they're not on imported goods anymore. They're actually made here. So it's going to be very interesting that way to see and this is the very beginning of it. So it's not like this is going to be nirvana or, return to Smallville or anything anytime soon. We're going to be looking at 20 years worth of work here to get manufacturing built back up in the U.S., even with robotic assistance. Some really good tea. Okay, so I'll take questions in just a minute. Wanted to make sure I didn't have anything else here. AI, robots. Okay, so the AI and the robot thing. There's a lot of guys in the woo-woo world that are stressed out by the AI, and it's kind of one of those things where, well, guys, now's the time to run from the bear, or to turn around and, raise up your arms and shout at the top of your lungs that you're going to kick the shit out of it. Because we're here now, and if you're not going to accept the proliferation of smarter and smarter software within your environment, then you're going to be in some rather distressed mental condition from this point going forward, because it's now irreversible, and the economic drivers for it are insatiable. AI is going to be hugely profitable at various different levels, not only in time saving and manufacturing accuracy and so on, but AI is not some of the things it's not creative. So any human that wants work will be able to get it just by being creative at something. It can be a good designer or whatever. They can, for instance, you can do AI that might make web pages, right? But you can't do AI that would create the new latest and greatest widget that goes on those web pages that attracts millions of people because of its creativity. AI is never going to do that. All AI is going to be able to do is to use that widget once that creative human has popped it out of their head and manifested. And so this is the time to get really serious about understanding what it is to be human in a knowledge economy, because that knowledge is related to, and it's actually really a human in a creative economy, because everything else can be automated. And that's the cool part. I spent a good portion of my life doing repetitious manual labor that need not involve a human, and it puts people at great risk of all different kinds of damage. I worked in sawmills. I got my hands all cut up with machinery that didn't function as it should, where the saw blade would just get off ever so slightly, and we're talking things that are 16 feet in diameter, and get off ever so slightly, and that ever so slightly it goes right through your thumb before you can even think about it, and it could have been controlled if you'd had some kind of a process that monitored the bearings and the race, maybe even shut down that saw because it was out of tune. And there's all these different kinds of things that this low-level AI kind of stuff is going to be good for. If you're a programmer, you can do the AI. There's just a lot of different approaches. There's Python, C++, Java, even JavaScript is now getting some AI components through libraries. So there's a whole lot of, there's a plethora of potential out there for people getting into the trade. I don't really worry about the giant computer AI that's going to come and try and eat my nads. I'm just enjoying the benefits of AI that monitors the lithium battery and keeps it at its appropriate voltage so the thing doesn't blow up, and it's done it as a little firmware on a little tiny chip. Speaking of which, on my ray gun there's some which is at the moment a big giant box. It's about 2 foot by 2 foot. But as it evolves towards a little handheld ray gun that I'll be able to go out and use, there's elements of it that I'm going to have to control, and I've decided my ray gun's going to run the Android OS, a stripped down version of the Android OS, because I don't have a whole lot of functionality to show it. I was going to put in an Arduino. I looked at Raspberry Pi. I've looked at a bunch of these small form factor PCs, and in the process surveyed some really cool stuff, like Intel's got this little NUC, computer out. That's really hardened, and you can put an additional nice plastic case around it, mount it in a garage, do all different kinds of things with it. Hang on a second. The guy wants to know why we're in a pro-Trump now as a society. And it has to do with cycles, guys. I mean, liberal versus conservative goes through time on a sine wave. You can plot it up against all different kinds of societies and their evolution. And like, for instance, in Rome, before Rome hit the particular Maunder minimum that caused, or the particular solar minimum that caused them to fail, they went through a period of a great liberalization where slaves were considered to be, and bear in mind they had a big slave class within the society, were in the process of becoming considered for citizens. It was the period of time where they had the slave rebellions, and they had the hyperinflation because they were debasing the currency, and they had a super liberal society. And, Caligula married his horse, that kind of thing, or Nero, one of these guys, right? And so those sorts of societies produce particular kinds of, or occur at particular times, particular points in the cycles, and they're followed by other kinds of regimes or trends that continue on from them. And so, the idea that we would ever get to a utopia or a permanent state of, ever-present growth is absurd. We're always going to go through these predictable cycles as the emotions of the humans are triggered by whatever it is that does so at a galactic level. And so we're at one of those particular points right now, is these cycles. I personally think that that a lot of the current thinking in quantum mechanics really validates astrology. And it really validates astrology at a sidereal level. At a sidereal level. And the closest thing we have to that now is, in a complete system, is the Vedic astrology. There's also Taoist astrology, but it's somewhat degraded. There hasn't been the continuity that went along because Mao caused such damage to the traditional Chinese arts. So their version of sidereal astrology has been neglected for so long that I don't think it's recoverable at this stage. But in any event, so we have Vedic astrology that can bring in aspects and attributes about the cycles that will affect us. Now, I think that there's some question as to how far down will it go, right? I know, for instance, that at a conceptual level, if one had the tools available, you could probably find some weird-ass little asteroid off somewhere that's going to zing around at a particular point in a particular house and a particular angle that would reflect what's going on with your blood pressure on a moment-by-moment basis, because these cycles are all interrelated, and the biorhythms that we're feeling are part of larger biorhythms that we further sectionate by our manifestation here, and that manifestation is guided by our DNA. Now, I think that it actually does come down to that level, but we'll never find that asteroid that syncs up with your particular heart rate or your blood pressure or any of this kind of stuff. So you're not going to be able to predict when you're going to have that particular heart attack based on this level of astrology. But I do think that we're going to be able to predict a lot of different nice cyclic things as a result of some of the quantum mechanics that are coming on out now that, lo and behold, reflect what we've got as a remnant art form or discipline from a society, 36,000 years ago. So anyway, that's just as an aside. I mean, I was shocked by some of the recent discoveries in the quantum world, which also that gets us back to I'm doing some programming on phones. Kathy's got an issue with her particular phone, and I'm going to write some software that'll help her with that. I've gotten back in and intrigued with Android and Java and doing some of this other stuff, but in some of the anyway, so some of the other cycles that the quantum guys are shooting for are, or some of the math that they're talking about cycles is convincing me that I'm correct, that there does exist right now a universal internet. And it may be galactic at, subsection. But if we just talked about the galactic internet, just in our local galaxy, that exists right now. It was created by some species, probably long dead, back millions of years ago, for all we know. And it's still operating. Other species have been discovering it and populating it, putting their stuff on it, as we will once we start getting machinery that will tie our computers into it. And because it's in existence now, it's a question of discovering the mechanisms by which it works, not having to build the whole thing. So, in other words, it's kind of as though it would be like Steve Jobs and Wozniak being in the garage and building that first Apple I. And as soon as they'd built that Apple, being able to instantly connect to the internet of today because the internet already existed. It was just outside their realm of existence until that first Apple I was created. Basically what we have to do is we have to create the first galactic internet network card, and that slots into one of our PCs. And from that point on, then we'll be able to download everything off of that internet, build the latest and greatest. So we'll go right from a beta version of that galactic internet card, that galactic network card. And as soon as it's operating, we'll be able to go to the galactic internet and pull down the latest and greatest access kinds of devices and build those. So we'll jump all through the development and go from the first Apple to an iPhone, just boom, like that, because we'll have available to us all this kind of knowledge. And then, at that same time, of course, we can apply those same kind of up-leveling techniques to basically every fucking thing we do. I mean, every single human application could potentially benefit from seeing what other species have done along that same kind of way. Now, it could be, too, that it drives us all crazy and we commit mass suicide. So we got to watch out for that. I don't know about Litecoin going to 1 billion, but I know they've hit some serious milestones. There's some interesting information that's coming out about Litecoin now. Once it's going to be on the Gemini, I think that was the one was Gemini, but once it's going to be on some of these other exchanges, we'll get those popping back up. No good word on Venezuela. They're part of the dollar death. They're just one of the shakier ones because they're competing with us for oil, and so their economy is tied to the petrodollar at a much higher degree. If they had been a banana producer, the banana prices are more stable, so they wouldn't have been hit so hard. The RV isn't going so well because it's the same issue as with doing reports, right? I'm getting back into it. I'm having less problems. But the anesthesia, I have no idea what chemicals they gave to me. I'm starting to get some memories back of the process of the surgery, but the anesthesia does a disconnect that makes me in your brain to the physical body that allows them to mess with the physical body without causing you pain. But at the same time, it also altered the vibration, so to speak. And so I've got to do my meditation and I've got to get back to where I was, to the point that I don't have those sorts of things intruding. And so especially with the why in the hell did that happen? Especially with the RV, no way you could do that and be, if there were any kind of extraneous body stuff popping up or any of that, you'd certainly have to question your results, even if you could do it. Dick Allgire's a real, he's like a national treasure. Okay, the Japanese have that concept of these people that are national treasure. Dick Allgire's a phenomenon. He's, like the shining gem of RV kind of stuff. He's experienced. He's a sifu. And he's really damn good. He's been doing it for some period of time. No, the dinar is not going to revalue. Okay, you got to understand the mechanism for it's a scam. The Bush family made millions, billions maybe for all I know, but they made millions off of selling dinars. Any currency to revalue requires that the operating system, the administration of that country, be willing to purchase their currency at the rate that you want it, at the rate of the exchange rate that you think is acceptable. So right now, maybe the Iraqi dinar goes for a penny. I have no idea, don't have any idea, but maybe $1 in Iraq, one Iraqi dollar or dinar is worth 1 penny US, okay? That means that's as much as the government of Iraq is willing to pay for that. If you expect that the government of Iraq is going to buy those back at $5 each or $1 each, parity, then you have to assume, if you think you're going to go to a bank and get turn in a dinar, an Iraqi dinar, and get $1, then you have to assume that the Iraqi government is willing to buy back that 1 dinar from you for $1. And where are they going to get the money, and what's their incentive to do so? There's zero incentive. And so everybody always, and this is the same thing with the Vietnamese dong and some of these other currencies that people have got these RV scams around. And the illogic of it suggests that somehow the banks will pay you more for those dinars than the government of Iraq would give for them. And they always cite Kuwait and the revaluation there. But there's a big difference because Kuwait was a defeated country that came back within months, backed by a royalty that had billions in petrodollars. And so they were at that point willing to buy back the Kuwaiti dinar in order to establish their sovereign currency again. But it ain't going to happen with Iraq because they don't have billions in oil dollars in a royalty that's willing to move back into the country. It's, pretty much not a going concern anymore. And until they have that, and at that point, why should they bother themselves with an old currency if they really wanted to reestablish? They'd just pop off a new one, probably a cryptocurrency, and just be done with the dinar totally. So let's see, a couple of more, and then I've got to get some stuff done here. I'm doing Android programming. Got to get that application out for Kathy, and then I'm going to do some other interesting things. Let's see. I don't know about the ammo thing. There's a whole lot of people that are suggesting that the U.S. is going to go in the way of a civil war. But nothing in our data sets in any of the emotional energy summations that are in there would suggest that. It suggests that we're going to go through a very revolutionary period of time. But most of the revolutionary words appear to be applied to or dominant now within more material things like, science and industry and that sort of a deal, not politics. There is revolution in politics, but it's not going towards the idea of conflicting revolutions like we had with the Bolsheviks attempting to take over the revolution after the Russians. Is not going, our data doesn't go towards U.S. Civil War kind of thing, right? I don't really see the Civil War. I see that we've got some really tough times. There's stuff in long-term data about the states themselves having to do a whole lot more as the federal government doesn't have the money to do it. And that over these next couple of years, the relationships of between the states will change. And there's a lot of language within that's been there since, I want to say, maybe 2001, that goes to the idea that the relationship of the states relationship between the states changing will be changing out of this federalist model and will be much more like the kind of language that we used to have before everything became so unified. And so it's going to cause its own set of problems and so on, but it's also an adaptive response to what's going to go on with the fading of the national currency. But at the same time that we have all this negative stuff about the fading of the national currency, about the breakup of the federalist system, the federalist glue, if you will, that is surrounding and dominating these United States, At the same time as we've got all of that, I've got data showing sci-fi world erupting, and new technologies, and new technologies coming out so fast that the combinoric effects leads to other new technologies before you can even get your new technology out the door, and a giant booming economy that pretty much goes on globally. So it's not like it's going to be a U.S. led or a U.S. Initiated recovery or anything like that. In fact, our data sets would argue otherwise. Okay, so our data sets would argue that it's going to be, less military-industrial complex kind of domination of things, and global consumerism. There's a lot of people that don't have shit, right? And they want stuff. And they're going to want a lot of stuff that we've got here in the U.S. that we're not going to be competing to buy. And maybe in some of these things, we could actually manufacture some of it here and compete with other people to provide globally. And we'll get to that over these next 10 years or so. At the moment, like I say, the big push for the U.S. is going to be somewhat isolationist as we attempt to rein things in and manufacturing comes back, and we have the impact of the big push for the tariffs, the breakdown of the dollar, and the infrastructure push that's going to be necessary here. Now, there's outliers within the data, and I'm assuming that that their presence is simply going to suggest that they are a component of the development of things, right? Hey, Gary, love you too, guy. Some of these outliers include things like Antarctica. There's tons of shit going on in Antarctica, all right? I don't know what. I don't have any definitive ideas about what's going on, but we know there's rays being shot out at hurricanes. There's weird stuff you can find even on the masked out Google Earth stuff. Bear in mind that Google Earth, they just white the stuff out. Like you're going to expect to see a giant white snowfield with no detail whatsoever, and you're going to be satisfied with that. So whatever is under some of these giant whited out areas is probably pretty interesting. And so these outliers may come in and affect our development of our sci-fi future. It may be that the reason we have a sci-fi future is because of these things, and that's why they're showing up in the data. I can't put an answer as to a why on that. I just know that they're temporally coincident. And so during the next couple of years, so 2019 to 2020, we should expect to see a lot of Antarctica language coming out, and hopefully actually get some understanding as to what's actually going on down there. Okay, so I think there's all kinds of undersea UFO guys there. Some of these things in, like the one in the Baltic and so forth, it's like those are extremely intriguing. Obviously, we're a species with amnesia, and so once you acknowledge that, then anything is open. How old the species is, how long it's been here, why there are the cycles that are going on, these kind of things. All of this is open to, or should be open to examination. Been on here a long time. I got to get off, guys. I got to do some more programming and shift the trailer and the truck around here. I guess that's it. Yeah. It's going to be fairly interesting. I wanted to see what the effect of 2 live streams in a short order would be on the algorithms, as well as get some of these things that had pissed me off or irritants out there. I'm doing better. The convalescence from the surgery is going well. The time stuff is going well. I've got some people I'm working with some of the time stuff in Australia and Japan. And some of the other programming stuff's going well as well. Not going to be doing reports for a number of months. Got some. Actually, what I would like to do relative to reports is to be able to come up with a system where I can just stream the things to phones through an app, and have the individual user be able to query on those areas, those subject areas that they're of interest, that they find are interesting to them. Probably there'll be a couple of reports out before I get that built, because it's going to involve totally reconfiguring the servers and populating databases that are going to be publicly accessible. Silver, by the way, is within that 2020 timeframe. So we'll see gold and silver escalate in nominal dollar terms over December 2018 and all of 2019. But we're not going to get into that discussed separation of silver into isotope A versus isotope B issues until in 2020. And that's when the silver ratio to gold and the amount of gold on the planet and all this stuff comes on up in a serious way within the data sets, within the generalized chaos of, let's call it the birthing of the sci-fi world. So a lot of people won't hear about it simply because they're going to have their heads down and be occupied with other things. But our data is forecasting that 2020 is, and the revolutionary energies are going to be fulfilled by a revolution in knowledge, which I find is curious, of course, because that's as we're moving into the age of Aquarius, which is the knowledge bearer and this kind of thing. So in 2020 on through for who knows how long, we're going to be in a situation where the breakout, the revolutionary fervor of a revolutionary impulse is going to come out in new knowledge. And a lot of that's going to be about our actual history, which I think is going to be kind of cool. It'll probably take us, 30 or 40 years to have a cohesive paradigm as to what has actually happened to humans and something that we can agree is more or less factual. But we should also have a whole lot more evidence going forward, being allowed to come out into the public as we get into this the chaotic period of the death of the dollar, the financial restructuring. Now, bear in mind that here's something too, okay? This is why it's not really particularly frightening. We've been through these currency problems before. The death of the dollar is going to be globally effective, but see, it's already affecting a lot of the globe now. All the peripheral, Turkey, Venezuela, all these countries that are having currency crises will get over it before the U.S. gets deep into the death of the dollar. So Venezuela will be starting to do better. Turkey will be doing better, just as the U.S. is going into, going to be hitting the flusher on the dollar. And they'll be coming out and building their own currencies and so on. And then we'll be playing catch up economically. Now, we've got a big boost because we've got all this secret shit that the deep state's been working on for 70 years. And some of that's going to be brought out of a necessity. And that's basically how we end up with sci-fi world. And that's the first few years of sci-fi world from an American perspective is going to be with us in a depression and us in a situation here in the U.S. where we're struggling, challenged, but overcoming the obstacles. And, we're making it work. We're working our way out. So, like I say, I'm very positive about 2020 and beyond. It's going to be a little interesting getting there and a lot of work, but I'm very positive. Going to have to go, guys. Yeah, we'll do one of these again in the future, too.